Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on history and how history is dealt with within Latinx studies. From the keywords piece that we had to read on history, what we learn is that Latinx history challenges traditional assimilation paradigm of U.S. history, where usually the way in which U.S. history is told is that all these different groups come to the United States and eventually assimilate into Americanness. That's typically not something that you find in Latinx historical narratives. It challenges American historical narratives of the U.S. as a nation of immigrants and melting pot idea that all of these different people come to the United States and sort of melt into one American culture. You don't find that either in Latinx history. In Latinx history, we also learn that the Latinx population in the United States isn't only composed of immigrants. It addresses not only the history of Latinxes in the US, but also Latin America and the connection between the two, and acknowledges the contributions and influence of Latinxes throughout the United States, and finally demonstrates that Latinx history is American history. Now, the article by Mario Garcia talks about how to sort of organize the history of Chicanos in particular in the United States. He himself is a Chicano historian and sort of talks about how he has come up with this framework of talking about Chicano history in terms of different generations. So he starts with the conquered generation, which encompasses the Mexican population that was already in the Southwest after the United States took over in 1848. This population often uses sort of this slogan, "We didn't cross the border crossed us," because they were already here. They're often talked about through this concept of internal colonialism, which suggests that the Chicanx population in the Southwest are a colonized people living within the colonizing power. And this population is also often discussed as being marginalized and disempowered, particularly once the U.S. takes over and those Mexicans in this area that had land, have businesses, and so on, eventually lost a lot of that economic and political power. The reading also talks about, resistance, right? These different generations, their stories aren't just about victimization or discrimination, but also the ways in which that they have resisted, right? And some examples for the conquered generation of resistance include Juan Cortina, which is the image you see here, who led a rebellion against Anglo-Texans' attempts to steal Mexican-American land. The group Gorras Blancas rebelled, particularly in New Mexico, against encroaching Anglo ranchers and railroads by cutting fences and destroying tracks. And they also practiced cultural resistance by upholding Mexican traditions, culture, and language. The next generation Mario Garcia talks about is the immigrant generation. This is a generation of Mexican immigration that came heavily between 1900 and 1930. And he talks about push factors and pull factors. Push factors describe the factors that were taking place in Mexico that pushed people out. And pull factors refers to what were the things that were happening in the United States that pulled people to come to the United States. So the push factors at this time were Porfirio Diaz's economic impact, displacing agricultural workers and farm owners in the United States. He ruled from 1876 to 1900s and implemented what was intended to be a modernizing version of the economy, but resulted in the displacement of a lot of the poor. And those poor ended up coming to the United States in search of better economic opportunities. Other reasons for why people were leaving at this time was the Mexican Revolution that starts in 1910, and the violence and instability that occurs as a result in the country leads to a lot of people choosing to leave. In the United States, at the same time, industrialization increases the demand for cheap labor in the US. So all of those workers that were being displaced in Mexico found a welcome environment for their labor in the United States. There were also other anti-immigrant laws against other groups, which limited the labor force from those other places like Asia to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which then meant that there weren't those people around to do the labor. So there was a demand to replace Asian labor with Mexican labor at this time. As the reading discussed, this generation contributed significantly to the economic development of the Southwest, as many places, railroad companies, mining companies, agriculture, cattle ranching, and so on, depended heavily on their labor. They also experienced, discrimination in wages, as the reading talked about. So there were different wages for Anglo laborers versus Mexican laborers. Their children attended segregated Mexican schools, and the image there is an example of what one of these schools looked like. And they also created barrios, communities where they could uphold their culture and protect themselves against discrimination. The generation following this one is the Mexican American generation. These are the children of those earlier Mexican immigrants who were born and raised in the US. And so they saw the United States as their homeland and Mexico more of sort of what their background or their ancestry was from. They were Americanized through school and American cultural experiences. We also see with this generation, particularly the youth generation, the rise of what became known as Pachuco culture, which was an urban Mexican American culture that was bicultural, and where they created sort of their own style of fashion, music, and so on, as you see depicted in these two images, that was a way for them to express their difference from mainstream American culture, but also how they were different from their Mexican immigrant parents. Many of these Mexican Americans served during World War II and saw it as their duty as Americans to serve in the war. And they also organized for educational and citizenship rights because, again, they felt they were Americans and deserved to have the same kinds of rights as their Anglo counterparts. The generation following is what becomes known as the Chicano generation. This is the generation of the 1960s and 1970s, which was much more radical generation of cultural nationalism. They no longer believed in working within the system as the previous generation did. They organized against institutional racism by calling for their own Chicano institutions and empowerment of the community. It included movements for unionizing farm workers, the land grant movement, educational rights and representations in schools, protests against the Vietnam War, and the creation of their own political party. Finally, Mario Garcia talks about the difficulties of talking about the post-Chicano generation, where it is a more contemporary time period from the 1980s to the present, and how much more diverse this population has become, even in the Southwest, where there aren't only Chicano folks in the Southwest, but Latinos from all different parts of Latin America and of all different backgrounds and experiences, as well as recognizing a Chicano experience that is beyond the Southwest, so that there are also Chicanos throughout the United States now as well. And so he has sort of talked about this generation as the Latino generation, which includes a lot of the immigration issues that have arisen since the 1980s, and recognizes the Latinx population nationally, not just focusing on Chicanos in the Southwest. The last article we had to read for today sort of takes a look at Chicano history from the experience of women in particular, and how Chicana historians have contributed and complicated, right, the kind of history that has been created by Chicano historians. A lot of this Chicano history has been inspired by the Chicana feminist movements of the Chicano generation era, Chicana feminism was also a part of the Chicano movement. Many of these women have recovered the history of Mexican American women prior to the 1960s, so they have also gone back even further, right, to sort of look at and dig up the experiences and histories of Mexican American women throughout the United States from its earliest, right, existence, or the earliest existence of this population within the United States borders. They reimagine women's roles and work and the family. A lot of what Chicana feminism did during the Chicano movement was to question the patriarchy and machismo that was existing within the Chicano movement. They were challenging sort of the traditional roles for women that were still being upheld, even within the radical nationalist Chicano movement. Especially ideas about, women being wives and mothers. And so they were young women themselves at the time who were challenging those roles as the only definitions for Chicana womanhood. They challenged cultural nationalism and their idea of the Chicano family, again, sort of upholding a particular heterosexual patriarchal type of family. But they also challenged mainstream white feminism for its lack of racial analysis. So even though they were seeing themselves as feminists, they were raising issues of sexism and gender inequality at the time. It didn't necessarily mean that they were following, right, mainstream white feminism the way it was being presented at that time. So they were also critical of it because white women weren't really considering issues of race, and certainly were not considering the experiences of the Chicano community. Finally, queer Chicanas are discussed in the article and how they brought in analysis of gender and sexuality and the inclusion of queer Chicana experiences into the histories of Chicana as well. And so they have expanded, broadened, right, what we talk about when we talk about Chicanx history in the United States. Now, clearly, these readings just show you a glimpse of what Latinx and Chicanx history is or has been. There are a vast number of Latinx historians who have been for 50 years or more now writing the histories of these different populations in the United States. There's a vast history of Puerto Ricans in the United States. There are people writing about Cuban Americans in the United States. And so the broader field of Latinx history is much bigger and broader than what I've presented here. But again, this is an introductory class. So the point of this class is to sort of give you an introduction to the different areas of the field of Latinx studies, and to demonstrate here with these readings in particular that there is a sort of subfield within Latinx studies that focuses specifically on the histories of these populations in the United States, but that their approach to history is also very broad and intersectional, that looks at gender, class, sexuality, and so on as well. So I hope this gives you a little bit of a glimpse into how we do history in the field of Latinx studies. This ends our lecture for this week, and I will see you next time.